World Geography, Southwest Asia, Middle East conflict. Here are the learning objectives. 1. Explain the Palestinian-Israeli conflict from the perspective of both sides. 2. Describe acts of terrorism committed by Israelis and Palestinians. 3. Identify the reasons behind the establishment of an Israeli state in Palestine. 4. Why have Israeli settlers established illegal settlements on Palestinian land? 5. What are the obstacles that stand in the way of establishing a Palestinian state? 6. What is the purpose of the separation barrier? Introduction. Roots of struggle. It's been a long struggle between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. At the root of this struggle is a historic claim to the land which lies between the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. Palestinian-Arab perspective. Over the last 100 years, the Palestinians have experienced colonization, expulsion, and military occupation. It's been a long and difficult search for self-determination and for coexistence with the Israeli nation. Israeli Jew perspective. The return to the land of their forefathers after centuries of persecution worldwide has not brought peace and security to the Jews. They have faced many crises as their Arab neighbors have sought to wipe Israel off the map. Early Zionist aggression. Zionism. The first Zionist Congress met in Switzerland in 1897. These were Jewish leaders who met to discuss the creation of a home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Of course, there were already people living in Palestine, and that was the Palestinian Arabs. Jewish immigrants began moving to Palestinian Arab areas in what was then a part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Turkish control of the region ended when Arab forces backed by Britain drove out the Ottomans at the end of World War I. On the left-hand side is a map of the Ottoman Empire. Balfour Declaration. Britain, of course, broke its promise of independence to the Arabs, and instead, in 1917, towards the end of World War I, they issued the Balfour Declaration, and this committed Britain to work towards the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The Palestinians were pretty much ignored. Terrorism. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, hundreds of thousands of Jews immigrated to British Palestine. This provoked unrest in Arab communities. Arabs felt they were being outnumbered. Militant and racist Zionist Jewish groups like Irgun and the Stern Gang, they began terrorist attacks on Palestinian and British targets with the aim of liberating Palestine by force. And on the left-hand side, you see a photograph of the bombed-out King David Hotel, which was attacked by Jewish terrorists. Proposed partition. In 1947, Britain handed over responsibility for solving this complex Zionist Arab problem in Palestine, handed that problem over to the United Nations. The United Nations, they recommended the partitioning of the territory into separate Jewish and Palestinian states. The Palestinians rejected this proposal. The plan was never implemented. On the right-hand side, you see a map of the UN plan to partition the area. Yellow would be the Arab state, and orange would be the Jewish state. Establishment of Israel. Independence and catastrophe. On May 14, 1948, with no consultation with the existing inhabitants of Palestine, the Jewish minority declared the land to be the State of Israel. The Palestinians, of course, referred to this declaration and the expulsion from their homes by the Jews. They call this the catastrophe, or al-Nakba. Arab defeat. Once the Jews declared their independence, 5 Arab armies from Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, they immediately invaded Israel, and the Israeli army immediately defeated them. Israel's borders now included the majority of what was former British Palestine. Egypt, however, they kept the Gaza Strip, and Jordan annexed the area around East Jerusalem and the West Bank. So Egypt was responsible for the Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip, and Jordan was responsible for those in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank area. Palestinian and Arab resistance. Palestinian refugees. Upon the defeat of the Arab armies, many Palestinian war refugees, they fled to neighboring countries, and they left their homes in the hands of the Israeli occupiers. Palestinian refugees, many of them also settled into United Nations refugee camps located in the Gaza Strip and West Bank. PLO. The Palestinians, of course, they formed a resistance movement to fight back against the occupation of their lands. The resistance movement was called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, and the leader was Yasser Arafat. The PLO launched attacks on Israel and other strategic targets. The most infamous Palestinian attack was an attack on Jewish athletes at the Munich Olympics in 1972. There on the left, you have a picture of Yasser Arafat. Six-Day War, 1967. Due to mounting tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors, Israel began hostilities which led to the Six-Day War. They seized the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel pushed Jordanian forces out of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and Israel seized the Golan Heights from Syria. At this point, Israel was directly responsible for all Palestinian refugees in these newly occupied territories. Here's several maps outlining the evolution of the State of Israel over the years. On the left-hand side, you have the UN Plan for Israel, which was rejected by the Palestinians. And then from 1949 to 1967, you have areas occupied by Jordan, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip administered by Egypt. And then after the Six-Day War in 1967, you see that Israel now occupies everything: the Golan Heights, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and even the Sinai Peninsula. Yom Kippur War, 1973. To regain territory lost in 1967, Egypt and Syria both attacked Israel on the festival of Yom Kippur in 1973. The Israelis pushed back the offenses, but they needed heavy support from the United States. Arab oil embargo. To punish those nations that supported Israel, and by consequence did not support the Palestinian Arabs, Saudi Arabia began the Arab oil embargo. This embargo restricted the supply of petroleum, and it led to an increase in prices around the world. Illegal Israeli settlements. Facts on the ground. In 1977, the Likud, the Israeli Likud political party, intensified the building of illegal Israeli settlements in the Palestinian West Bank and Gaza. Now, these were occupied territories, occupied by Israel, and according to international law, you can't build Israeli settlements on Palestinian territory. That would be against the rules. The objective of the Likud party was that they wanted to create facts on the ground, facts that would prevent any further territorial compromise. Essentially, there wouldn't be any land left for a Palestinian homeland if it was all occupied by Jews in their settlements. Peace between Israel and Egypt. Treaty and assassination. In 1979, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, he became the first Arab leader to recognize and sign a peace treaty with Israel. Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt at that time. Later, fundamentalist Islamic fighters, early elements of Al-Qaeda, this group was opposed to the existence of a Jewish state on Arab lands, and they assassinated Sadat in 1981. Palestinian Intifada, 1987 to 1993. Frustration over occupation. A mass uprising, or what's called an intifada, began in the Israeli-occupied territories because Palestinians were frustrated over their lack of opportunities. They were tired of being occupied by outsiders. The protests took the form of civil disobedience, general strikes, boycotts on Israeli products, graffiti, and barricades of burning tires. Stone-throwing demonstrations by young people against heavily armed occupation troops, this really captured international attention at the time. Oslo peace process. Negotiation. In June 1992, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, he sent his foreign minister Shimon Peres to Oslo, Norway for secret talks with Palestinian negotiators. At these talks, Palestinians agreed to recognize the right of Israel to exist in return for the beginning of a phased dismantling of Israel's occupation of Palestinian areas. Controversial issues. Some of the most controversial issues were to be addressed over a 5-year period following the Oslo Accords. Some of these controversial issues were the establishment of a Palestinian state. That's the most controversial. What would be the final status of the city of Jerusalem? Would it be occupied by Israel? Would it be part of Palestine? Would it be shared by both? Also to be negotiated was what was the state of Jewish settlements throughout the occupied territories. What would happen to them? Would they need to be dismantled? And what would happen to the fate of Palestinian refugees living in other countries? Assassination of Rabin. Religious fundamentalists in Israel, they were furious at the surrender of Jewish land to the Palestinians. Before the peace treaty even got off the ground, a Jewish Zionist named Yigal Amir assassinated the Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, in November 1995. At this point, the peace process was dead. The Second Intifada. Airstrikes and suicide bombs. By the end of 2000, a second intifada raged against Israel occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, he wanted to end the demonstrations, and he used extreme force by assassinating Palestinian militants on the streets with missiles and in their homes. In response, Palestinian militants stepped up their suicide bomb attacks in Israeli cities. Separation barrier. Another thing that happened in response to the Second Intifada was that Israel began to build a separation barrier, a wall, around the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. They said it was to prevent attacks inside Israel. Recent events. Hopelessness. The Gaza Strip, as I speak, is sealed off, and Palestinians live in extreme poverty without hope. Palestinians in the occupied territories, such as the West Bank, they continue to be subject to strict military regulations. It restricts how they can travel and where they can travel, what roads they can use. Very strict control over their lives. Jewish settlers continue to seize the best land and build illegal settlements with the support of the government. And walls and roadblocks cut Palestinians off from one another. Stateless nation. According to international law, it's the responsibility of an occupying power, in this case Israel. It's their responsibility to fairly administer the territory it seizes until it is returned to its rightful owners. The Israelis have simply not met these obligations. Instead, they've plundered Palestinian resources, they've diverted precious water to Israeli farms, and they've mined for minerals for use in Israeli factories on Palestinian land. The Palestinians remain stateless. They're a nation of people without a land to legally occupy. Here you have a current map of Israel with the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights marked out in the orange color. The end. Thank you for your attention.